Tales of the Greek and Roman gods continued. Bacchus. Among all the maidens whom Jupiter honored with his love, none was more beautiful than Semele, daughter of Cadmus and Harmonia. Cadmus was the brother of Europa, whom Jupiter, in the form of a white bull, carried on his back across the sea. The maiden's 3 brothers had been with her in the meadow, and had witnessed her strange departure, but knowing that it would be useless to attempt to catch the fleet animal, they hurried to their father, Agenor, who told him of the manner in which his favorite daughter had been spirited away. The old man was frenzied with grief, and bade his 3 sons to go in search of Europa, and not return until they had found her. The youths then set out, accompanied by their mother, Telephassa, and spent many weary days in a fruitless search for their stolen maiden. At last, Phoenix refused to go any further, and, not daring to return to his father, he remained in a land that was afterwards called in his honor Phoenicia. Celix, the second brother, grew weary of the hopeless quest and settled in a country that was named from him, Cilicia. And then finally, Telephassa, exhausted by fatigue and grief, died, and Cadmus was left to continue the search alone. He kept doggedly on for many days, and when he reached the town of Delphi, he consulted the oracle, hoping to find some clue to help him. To his surprise, the oracle gave an ambiguous answer. Follow the cow, and settle where she rests. Cadmus left the temple, and before he had journeyed far, he saw a cow walking leisurely in front of him. Judging this to be the animal intended to guide him, he followed her, and on the way was joined by a curious crowd who were eager to see where the absurd procession would finally stop. Some hoped that by accompanying the hero on his march, that they might meet with new adventures. Well, the cow at last lay down in Boeotia, and here it was where Cadmus founded the city of Thebes. To reward Cadmus for his loving search for Europa, Jupiter gave him in marriage the fair Harmonia, daughter of Mars and Venus. The child of this union was Semele, whom Jupiter wooed in the disguise of a mortal. But such was the maiden's pride that she would not listen to his pleading until he told her who he really was. Then her love was easily won, for no pride could be above yielding to the ruler of Olympus. Jupiter was very happy in the society of Semele, and went down to the earth many times to visit her, but it was inevitable that Juno should notice his frequent absences, and should set out to finding out where the charm lay that lured him so often to the earth. When she discovered the beauty of her rival, she decided upon an ingenious method of punishing her, and accordingly took the form of Semele's old nurse, Beroe. By feigning and loving solicitude for her charge's welfare, she soon won the confidence of the unsuspecting maiden, and listened with well-concealed anger while Semele talked of her lover, and showed her pride in having won the affection of the greatest of the gods. The nurse was evidently delighted at her happiness, but seemed worried over the new suitor's identity, and now and then expressed a doubt as to whether he really was the great Jupiter. On questioning the maiden more closely, she assumed a virtuous indignation when Semele admitted that her lover always visited her in the disguise of a mortal, and that she had only his word as proof of his divinity. Hearing this, the old woman urged Semele to make sure that it was no impostor who was playing on her credulity, and pricked the girl's pride by asking her why. Why was it that Jupiter, if it were indeed Jupiter, should not honor her as he did the stately Juno by appearing before her in all of his splendid majesty? Then the pretended nurse described the glory of Jupiter as it was seen by the dwellers of Olympus, and so worked up upon Semele's pride and curiosity that the unsuspicious maiden promised to put her lover to the test. So, when Jupiter came again, she begged him to grant her a favor. The ruler of the gods, not knowing of Juno's wiles, readily promised to grant any request that Semele might make. To further bind himself, he swore by the river Styx, the most terrible of all oaths. And then the maiden bade him return to Olympus, clothe himself in all his regal apparel, omitting no part of his terrible splendor, not even the dreaded thunderbolts, and having done this, return to her, that she might know he was indeed the king of the gods, the awful Thunderer. Jupiter was dismayed by this request, for he knew that no mortal could endure the greatness of his glory. He begged Semele to ask for another question, but the maiden was obstinate, and insisted upon her request being granted. Sorrowfully, Jupiter returned to Olympus, and after robing himself in his fearful majesty, he dimmed the radiance wherever he could, wrapped about him the mildest lightning, and then took in his hand the feeblest thunderbolt. But in spite of his attempts to lessen his great splendor, even this mild glory so overwhelmed poor Semele that when Jupiter appeared before her, she dropped dead at his feet. In trying vainly to bring her back to life, Jupiter did not notice what havoc the lightning that played about his head was making in the palace. In a short time, the entire place was reduced to ashes, and in the smouldering ruins, the body of Semele was consumed. The only person who escaped uninjured was the infant son of Jupiter and Semele, the golden-haired Bacchus. Having rescued his son from the burning palace, Jupiter first entrusted him to his aunt, Ino, who cared for him as tenderly as if he were her own child. But the jealous hatred of Juno was not satisfied with the death of Semele, and she tried to extend her vengeance to Bacchus by sending the Fury Tisiphone to goad Athamas, the husband of Ino, into madness. As king of Thebes, Athamas had always been a kind ruler, but when the frenzy, inspired by cruel Juno, took possession of him, he imagined that his wife and children were wild beasts, and in a rage he attempted to kill them. He did succeed in slaying Learchus, but Ino and her other son, Melicertes, escaped from his murderous fury, and afterwards became deities of the ocean not daring to leave the infant Bacchus in such a household, and fearing the further persecutions of Juno, Jupiter took the boy to Mount Nysa, where the Nymphs, the Nysiades, guarded him faithfully. During his youth, Bacchus was made a god of wine and revels, and was entrusted to the tutorship of Silenus, one of the most famous of the satyrs. This jovial old man had a bald head, pointed ears, a fat red face, and a body that was half man and half goat. As he carried a wine bag with him wherever he went, he was generally tipsy, and would have broken his neck long before reaching old age if he had tried to walk unsupported. But some of Bacchus's chosen band of followers always held him up on either side, or, when they themselves were unsteady, set him on the back of a donkey. Thus protected, he roamed about with Bacchus, and taught him all the craft of wine growing and the making of the choicest wine. The young god soon became a master of revels, and had a large train of followers composed of men, women, nymphs, fauns, and satyrs. They were usually crowned with ivy leaves, and were always drinking wine, eating grapes, singing and dancing merrily. The most unruly among them were the Bacchantes, who, though women, were often so crazed with wine and the excitement of their dancing that they committed such inhuman crimes as tearing the musician Orpheus to pieces. And so, wherever Bacchus travelled, and it was far and wide, he taught the people the art of cultivating grapes and making wine. He was always welcomed, and when they knew he was approaching, men, women, and children flocked to meet him and his merry retinue. Juno tried hard to check his triumphant progress, but she did not dare take his life for the fear of Jupiter's wrath. So she afflicted him with a kind of madness that drove him forth a wanderer alone all over the earth. He had many adventures during this unhappy period, and finally landed in Phrygia, where the goddess Rhea cured him and taught him her religious rites. After this, he wandered in Asia, India, teaching the people the wonderful new art of making wine. When he returned to Greece, he was welcomed everywhere, until he reached his native city of Thebes, where his cousin Pentheus was king. When Pentheus heard the people were flocking out of the gates to meet Bacchus and his revellers, he tried to stop the excited crowds and force them to return. In vain he pleaded, commanded, threatened. Men and women, and even the little children, were eager to join in the revels, and would not turn back. Then Pentheus sent some of his servants to seize Bacchus and bring him as a prisoner to the city. Soon the messengers returned, but they had not succeeded in getting near the god, so great was the crowd that pressed eagerly around him. They had, however, captured one of his followers, and when they dragged their prisoner before the king, he stood in the presence of the angry monarch without any sign of fear in his calm face. Pentheus commanded the man to tell what sort of revelry and rites were performed under the leadership of Bacchus, and threatened to put him instantly to death if he did not tell the truth. The prisoner, smiled at the king's anger, and seemed quite undisturbed by the threats against his life. He refused to tell anything of the ceremonies attending the worship of Bacchus, but began calmly to relate his own story. He said that his name was Hercules of Maeonia, and that he was a poor fisherman by birth, but had himself learned the pilot's art of steering by the stars. He had thus become a master of cruising vessels, and once, when he was near the island of Dia, he sent some of his men to shore for fresh water. They soon returned, bringing with them a youth whom they had found asleep in the forest and had captured, hoping to obtain a large ransom for him, as the lad was surely the son of some king. So haughty and regal was his bearing. When Hercules saw the youth, he begged his men not to force him on board the ship, for the pilot felt convinced that it was no mere mortal who stood proudly before them. But the sailors would not listen to his advice, and thrust the youth roughly on board. It was then that Hercules refused to steer the ship, but the men only laughed and declared that they could pilot the craft as well as he could. An angry discussion took place upon the decks, and soon the quarrelling grew so loud that the captured youth, who had been gazing listlessly over the sea, turned to the wrangling crew and asked in what direction the ship was sailing. "We will steer wherever we wish to go," replied one of them, with a wink at his companions. "Then, how about we sail back to Naxos? For that is my home," said the youth. The sailors promised to do so, but the ship turned towards Egypt, where they hoped to sell their prize for a large sum of gold. Hercules made several brave attempts to get possession of the helm and steer for Naxos, but the sailors struck him down and threatened to even throw him overboard if he was to interfere with their plans. Soon, the lad seemed to notice that the familiar shores were receding, and anxiously inquired if they were really sailing towards Naxos. He begged them not to ill-treat a friendless boy, but to let him return home in safety. And then the crew, weary of their pretense, told him brutally that he was being taken to Egypt to be sold as a slave, and that he could try his pretty speeches on his future master. The youth did not reply to these taunts, but looked calmly at the jeering sailors and raised his hand above his head. Immediately the ship stopped, as if it had been suddenly rooted to the sea, and though the men pulled frantically at the oars, not an inch could the vessel move. And then, as in a dream, they saw ivy twining rapidly across the sails and wrapping the oars in its strong tendrils. A vine with its heavy clusters of grapes clung to the mast and the sides of the ships. There was the delicious smell of crushed fruit in the air, and the fragrance of new-made wine. The sailors stared at the transformed ship and the captured youth, who now shook off his mask of simplicity and appeared before them in all his godlike beauty. For it was no other than the divine Bacchus, whom they had derided and hoped to sell as a slave. The sound of flutes was heard all around him, and the shrill notes of pipes. At the feet of Bacchus crouched tigers, lynxes, and panthers, and the god himself bore in his hand a staff wreathed in ivy. And then terror seized the trembling sailors, and they sprang madly over the side of the ship. But as soon as they touched the water, they were changed into dolphins. Only Achates was left standing on the deck before the smiling Bacchus, who bade him have no fear, but take the helm and steer straight for Naxos. The pilot Achates gladly obliged, and soon they reached their desired port, where he left his ship and became a follower of Bacchus, the god of wine. When Achates had finished this remarkable story, King Pentheus swore that not a word of it was true, and ordered his prisoner to be taken away at once and executed. The soldiers threw Achates into a dungeon, but while the preparations for his execution were being made, his chains suddenly dropped off, and his prison doors flew open. When the jailers came to lead him to his death, he was nowhere to be found. While the king had learned that the people were thronging around Bacchus in this Cithæron mountain just outside the city, and were eagerly joining in all the joyous rites that attended the worship of the god of wine, the shouts of the Bacchanals filled the air, and in spite of his anger against them, Pentheus was curious to see what these ceremonies were that occasioned such roisterous mirth. And so he disguised himself as a beggar and joined the shouting crowd that surrounded Bacchus and his followers. The noisiest of the revelers, of course, the Bacchantes, who danced and sung in a very frenzy of excitement as they tossed their ivy wreaths into the air and poured the red wine recklessly upon the ground. When this group, flushed with wine and half-clad, whirled madly toward him, the king was astonished to see among them his own mother, Agave. As he leaned nearer to the shouting dancers, wondering how his mother came in to join such things, she suddenly saw him, and pointing a finger at his shrinking figure, cried out the words, "There is the monster who prowls in our woods. Come on, sisters. I will be the first to strike the wild boar." Blinded by the madness that Bacchus had purposely inspired, she rushed upon the terrified king, followed by a crowd of half-crazed Bacchantes. In vain did Pentheus cry out that he was her son. Agave and her companions trampled him down in their fierce onslaught, and in a moment they had torn him to pieces. Thus was the worship of Bacchus established in Greece. The spot that the god of wine loved best on earth was the island of Naxos, and here he spent much of his time when he was not wandering all over the earth to teach the art of wine-making. One day, Bacchus was walking on the seashore with his ivy-crowned company, who followed him singing and dancing to the music of their shrill pipes. As they neared a spot where the rocks rose like a cliff above the water's edge, they discovered a maiden sitting on the white sand. This was Ariadne, who had been deserted by her lover Theseus and left to pine away alone on the island. For days, Ariadne had sat looking mournfully out over the sea, and now, when Bacchus, with his joyous group of revelers, suddenly broke in upon the silence of her solitude, she was frightened by the sight of so many strangers. But Bacchus soothed her fears, and in a short time so won the maiden's confidence that he persuaded her to become his wife. Ariadne was quite content to stay on the island with such a merry company, and if she ever felt any regret over the faithless Theseus, it was soon forgotten in the joy of the wedding celebrations, which lasted for several days. As a marriage gift, Bacchus placed on Ariadne's white forehead a crown adorned with 7 glittering stars. But wonderful as it was, it did not eclipse the beauty of the wearer. The happiness of the newly wedded pair did not last long, however, for in a few short months Ariadne sickened and died. After her death, Bacchus left the island and did not return there for many years. But before he set sail, he took Ariadne's crown and threw it up into the sky, where it forms the brilliant constellation known as Corona. One day, Silenus fell asleep in the forest, and his companions, believing him safe for a while, went away and left him propped up against a tree with his wine bag at his side. Here he was found by some peasants who were subject of Midas, the king of Lydia. The rustics watched the sleeping Silenus for a long time, wondering whom he might be. But at length the old man woke up, and after rubbing his eyes, asked the staring peasants where he was. As he received no answer to his question, Silenus motioned to the rustics to help him up, and then started to hunt for Bacchus and his lost companions. Seeing him unable to walk, the men led him to the court of King Midas, whom, as soon as he saw the wanderer's jolly red face and his body, half goat, half man, knew at once that it was Silenus, the tutor of Bacchus. This Midas was the same king who had challenged Apollo to compete in the musical contest with Pan, and, because of his unfair decision, had been cursed with donkey's ears by the offended god. The fact that Silenus had ears unlike the average mortal may have made King Midas feel a bit more sympathy for the old man's distress, but whatever the reason might be, he entertained Silenus royally for 10 days, and then led him back to his pupil, who had been wondering at his long absence. Delighted to have Silenus return to him unharmed, Bacchus promised to give the king any reward he might name, and Midas, being very avaricious, asked the god to grant that all that he touched should turn to gold. Bacchus had hoped that Midas would desire a better gift than this, but having made a promise, the god was ready to fulfill it, and he therefore assured the king that his wish was granted. Midas, overjoyed by his good fortune, hastened back to his palace, and on the way he hesitatingly tried his new power. He touched some leaves that hung from the trees nearby, and immediately they became golden. He took up a stone from the roadway, and it turned to gold in his hand. He plucked an apple, and in a moment it looked like one of the golden fruit from the garden of Hesperides. Midas was almost beside himself with joy, and as soon as he reached his palace, he began at once to turn all of his furnishings to gold. He was so delighted with his wonderful gift that he felt no desire to eat, or drink, or rest. But at last he grew a little weary of turning things into gold, and being hungry, sat down to his well-filled table. He took great pleasure in seeing the cloth and the cups and the plates change as everything else had done at his touch, but to his great amazement and horror, he also found that the bread that he took in his hand, the food that touched his lips, turned into a hard, unyielding gold. He tried to drink from the shining cups, but the wine in his mouth became melted gold. Then Midas knew the real meaning of his magic touch. It was a curse, and realized sorrowfully that until it was taken away, he would slowly starve in the midst of his great wealth. Already he hated his gift, and longed for some way to divest himself of his ill-fated power. He cried aloud for Bacchus to help, but no answer came to his prayers. Again he besought the god, and this time acknowledged his avarice and lamented the greed that had led him to ask for the gift of the golden touch. Bacchus had heard his prayers, and believing him truly repentant, commanded him to go to the river Pactolus, trace the stream to its source, and plunge his head and body into the purifying water. In this way he could cleanse himself of his fault and its punishment. Midas did as he was instructed, and came away from the river a wiser and happier, though a poorer man. If at any time he was ever tempted to regret his lost gift, he had only look into the river at the glittering golden sand on the bed of the stream, for where the king had stood, the sand was changed to gold, and so it has remained to this very day. Pan and the Nymphs. Pan, the god of woods and fields, god of the flocks and the herds, and patron deity of all shepherds, was said to be the son of Mercury. It is apparently not known who his mother was, but she must have had some sylvan blood in her veins, for the youthful Pan showed every evidence of having been born of woodland creatures, as he had the pointed ears of the fawns, and the horns and goat's legs of the satyrs. The story goes that his mother, whichever nymph it was of the many reputed to have borne him, was disgusted with his absurd appearance, and refused to acknowledge him as a child. But Mercury was delighted with his son's grotesque figure, and took him to Olympus to amuse the gods. Pan's favorite dwelling place was Arcadia, where he wandered all over the hills and among the rocks, or roamed through the fertile valleys. He delighted in hunting, and amused himself with various pastimes, his special pleasure being to lead in the dances of the nymphs. He was devoted to music, and was usually seen playing on the syrinx, or shepherd's pipes, which he himself invented and named from a nymph whom he unsuccessfully wooed. The maiden Syrinx was a follower of Diana, and one day, as she was returning from the chase, she met Pan, who immediately fell in love with her beauty and begged her to be his wife. The nymph had always scorned to listen to any lover, and Pan's appearance did not tend to soften her objections. So, while he was praising her many charms and pleading for her love, she turned and ran away. The woodland god was not to be put off so lightly, however, and he promptly gave chase to the fleeing maiden, who, finding that her pursuer was gaining on her, called wildly on the river nymphs for help. She had, by this time, reached the edge of the water, and just as Pan's arms were about to enfold her, the kindly nymphs turned her into a cluster of reeds. The god was much chagrined at the failure of his hopes, but since he could not have the living maiden, he determined to take whatever remained of the beautiful thing that had charmed him. And so he gathered a bunch of reeds, and after cutting them into unequal lengths, bound them together into a sort of shepherd's pipes. When he put the reeds to his lips, they gave forth the softest and most plaintive tones, and Pan called them the syrinx in honor of the nymph whom he loved. Before inventing this new instrument, Pan had played upon the flute, and it was his skill in this direction that made King Midas dare to affront Apollo by declaring Pan to be the better musician. The god of woods and fields was not, however, a frequenter of palaces, but made his home in grottos and piped to the murmuring trees. He loved to prowl by night in lonesome places, and lurk among the shadows where some belated traveler, startled by the weird hoot of an owl, would see his grotesque form and rush away, filled with an unreasoning terror called a panic. Pan's partners in the sylvan dance were the wood nymphs, who always welcomed him and his followers. When his days were spent among the mountain solitudes, the Oreads, or the mountain nymphs as they are called, danced with him in the moonlight, and when he preferred to live in the valleys, the Dryads, or nymphs of vegetation, joined in the revels led by Pan and his company of fauns and satyrs. The Naiades, the beautiful water nymphs who dwelled in the clear depths of the fountains, did not come out of their quiet haunts to take part in the merriment, nor did the shy Hamadryads leave the safe shelter of their trees to mingle in the joyous dance. Among these latter nymphs, each had her particular tree, and lived and died with one entrusted to her care. It was held, therefore, to be an act of wanton cruelty to destroy or even mar a tree, lest the Hamadryad who inhabited it should be hurt and possibly killed. It was unwise to break off a flower recklessly, or to pull it rudely from the earth, for in this humble form might be lodged the spirit of some woodland creature. Such a sad mistake did Dryope once make, and suffered for her carelessness by being changed from a mortal into a Hamadryad. Dryope was a beautiful young princess, the wife of Andremon, and the mother of a golden-haired boy. Every day she carried her children to a small lake near the palace, and let him gather the gaily covered flowers that grew on the water's edge. There was one day, as she wandered by the lake, that Dryope saw a lotus blossom, and pointed it out to her little son, who immediately tried to pluck it. As it was much beyond his reach, his mother leaned over the water and broke it off at the stem. But to her surprise, she saw drops of blood slowly oozing from it, and as the boy eagerly grasped the flower in his chubby little hand, the crimson stream trickled through his clasped fingers. He dropped the blossom with a frightened cry, and ran screaming to the palace, while Dryope stood looking down bewildered at the bleeding flower. Just then she heard a voice telling her that she had killed the nymph Lotus, who, to escape from the arms of the hateful god Priapus, had taken the form of a lotus flower. When Dryope realized the dreadful thing that she had unknowingly done, she turned pale with fright and would have hurried away from the unlucky spot. But when she tried to turn from the sight of the dying flower, she found that she could not move. Her feet seemed rooted to the ground, and as she looked down, she was horrified to see that a rough bark was beginning to enclose her limbs. With dreadful rapidity it spread upward, and soon encircled her whole body, while her arms changed into twisted branches and her hands into green leaves. In vain she called to her husband and her friends for help, but when they arrived, there was nothing left of the fair Dryope but her tear-stained face, which was covered all too soon by the cruel bark. Just before she disappeared completely from their sight, she begged that her little son might be taught to play beneath her branches. And when, in all the after days, the boy sat willingly beside the tree and listened to the soft rustling of the leaves, the passers-by would say, "Dryope, Dryope is whispering to her child." The danger of recklessly destroying any tree is shown by the story of Erysichthon, who dared to defy the goddess Ceres, and so received a fitting punishment. There was a certain grove of trees sacred to Ceres, and among them was a lofty oak in which votive tablets were often hung, and around which the nymphs and dryads danced hand in hand. Erysichthon ordered his servants to cut down this venerable oak, and when they hesitated, telling him it was a tree beloved by Ceres and should not suffer such a sacrilege, he seized the axe himself and made a deep gash into the trunk. To the great horror of all those who stood by, blood began to flow from the wound, and Erysichthon was about to deal the tree another blow when one of his servants caught his arm, imploring him not to touch the oak again, for the blood showed that a Hamadryad was being wounded. Maddened at this interference, and determined to carry out his brutal will, Erysichthon declared that he would cut down the tree, if by so killing 12 dryads. He lifted his axe for a mighty stroke, and as the servant again sought to stay his arm, he turned fiercely and killed the man with a swift blow. He then proceeded to fell the tree, and as soon as it was lying, bruised and bleeding, on the ground, the nymphs rushed to Ceres and begged her to punish this wicked violation of her grove. The goddess promised that Erysichthon's deed would not be unpunished, and sent an Oread to the remote part of Scythia, where the ice lies thick on the dreary soil, and the land is always desolate. Here dwell drowsy cold and paleness, and shuddering and dreadful famine. When the Oread drew near this barren country, she saw far off the gaunt form of Famine pulling up with her teeth and claws and scant bits of vegetation that could be found here and there in the frozen earth. The nymph did not want to linger near the dreadful form of Famine, lest the hag should reach out her lean finger and touch the maiden's robes. So she hurriedly delivered the message of Ceres, and sped quickly back to her own fair land of Thessaly. Not daring to disobey the goddess's command, Famine left her dreary country and sought out the home of Erysichthon. She found him asleep, and as she slept, she enfolded him with her wings and breathed into his nostrils her deathly breath. Then she returned to her frantic digging in the unyielding soil. When Erysichthon awoke, he was at once consumed with a fierce hunger. But however much he ate, the terrible craving never ceased. All day long he devoured things greedily, but at night his hunger was still unsatisfied. His servants piled up food in enormous quantities before him, but the gnawing pangs of hunger never left. He spent all his wealth in vain to buy enough food to appease the insatiable monster within him. But though he at last sold all he had, even to his house and clothing, it was not enough to buy him food that he craved. There was nothing left for him now but his daughter, and by his frenzied hunger he offered to sell her to a slave dealer. The girl pitied her father's sufferings and would have done anything to help him, but she resented his baseness in selling her, for she came of a noble race. While her purchaser was disputing with the father over the price, the maiden, who was standing on the seashore a short distance away from her new master, implored Neptune to save her from the disgrace of being sold as a slave. The kindly sea god heard her cry and changed her into an old fisherwoman. When the bargain between Erysichthon and the dealer was settled, the man looked around for his new purchase, but she was nowhere to be seen. In fact, the only person on the seashore, besides the brutal bargainers, was an old woman who sat there mending her net. The irate owner searched in vain for his new slave, and even asked the fisherwoman if she had seen a weeping maiden. But unable to find the girl, he at last went away, concluding that Erysichthon's daughter had tried to escape and had so been drowned in the sea. The maiden rejoiced at her deliverance, but her cruel father, on seeing her regain her own form, decided that this was an easy way of making the money that he desperately needed. And so he sold his daughter again and again, and each time she sought the help of Neptune, who obligingly turned her into many different forms. At last, even this device failed to bring Erysichthon enough money to meet the ever-increasing demands of his hunger. In despair over the lack of food, he began to eat his own flesh, and in a short amount of time he had devoured so much of his body that death came to end his torment. And so Ceres was finally avenged. The Hamadryads were seldom seen by men, but people knew them to be both gentle and beautiful. At least, that was their reputation. That they could repay a kindness is well shown in the story of Rhoecus, who gained the love of one of the shyest of these nymphs. One day the youth happened to see an oak tree bent so far down by the wind that some of its branches were already broken. He propped up the tree and gently bound up the broken limbs, but then as he turned to go, he heard a soft voice calling him. It was the Hamadryad, who had been expected to die with her stricken tree, and was now so grateful to Rhoecus that she bade him ask her of any reward that he wished. The youth boldly asked for her love, and the nymph reluctantly yielded to his wish, promising to meet him at the oak tree each day just before sunset. To keep him mindful of the hour set for the tryst, she told him she would send him a messenger, a bee, who would also guide him to the spot where she was waiting. Rhoecus was very happy with the Hamadryad, and never failed to follow the flight of the bee that came each day at sunset to lead him to the trysting place. One morning, however, he began to play at dice with his friends, and the game continued through the long summer afternoon. As it drew towards sunset, Rhoecus forgot that it was his hour to meet the Dryad, and continued his game, even though he noticed vaguely that a bee was buzzing near him. Soon, the bee came close to his face, and buzzed so persistently that Rhoecus brushed it angrily away. But each time he tried to shake it off, it came buzzing back, and at last he struck so viciously that it fell to the ground. But then in a flash, Rhoecus remembered his promise to the Dryad, and throwing away his dice, he hurried to the trysting place. He called to the nymph and begged her to come out to him once more, but no sweet face appeared till a voice spoke from the heart of an oak tree, bidding him a sad farewell. Rhoecus had already repented bitterly of his forgetfulness, but nothing could restore him to favor. He sat all night beside the oak tree, but the Dryad never came to him again. Vesta was the oldest child of Saturn and Rhea, and was the goddess of the family hearth. As the hearth was the basis of all domestic ties, Vesta was considered the guardian of family happiness, and her worship was an essential part of family life. The hearth in the ancient days had a much greater significance than in modern times, for it was the center of the household, around which the family gathered for their common meal and common worship. On the hearth, as an altar fire, the head of the household offered prayers and sacrifices, and made a bond of union so generally recognized that he who partook of food there, or who shared in the family worship, could ever afterwards lay a claim to the master's hospitality. If a suppliant was seeking protection from any danger, it was to a man's hearth that he came as a sure place of refuge. The flames that burned on his family altar were sacred to the goddess Vesta, and the prayers for domestic happiness on the household's welfare were usually offered to her. Thus, the fire burning on the hearth of each dwelling was a perpetual worship of the beneficent Vesta, and even the sacrifices made to the other gods were partly in her honor. For whenever the flames were rekindled, a prayer was offered to the goddess of the family fireside. Every dwelling, therefore, was, in some sense, a temple of Vesta, but there was also in each city a stately edifice where all citizens worshipped at her sacred fire, and were thus bound together in one great family. You see, in Rome, where the worship of Vesta was most celebrated, a beautiful circular temple dedicated to the goddess stood in the Forum. It was not necessary to place a statue of Vesta here, for the eternal fire that glowed on her altar was her living symbol, and through this she was worshipped. This fire was supposed to have been brought to Italy by Aeneas when he fled from burning Troy and carried with him out of the city two valuable possessions, i.e., the fire of Vesta and his own household goods, or penates. When a colony was sent out from any city, the emigrants took some of the fire from the temple of Vesta in their mother town and guarded it during their voyages, that they might use its flames to light the fires that were to burn on the hearths of their new homes. Each city cherished carefully the fire that was sacred to Vesta, and never allowed it to burn out, for that was an evil omen, sure to presage disaster. If by any chance it was allowed to become extinct, it was never relit from any ordinary fire, but was rekindled with a spark produced by friction, or by drawing fire from the sun's rays through a glass. The temple at Rome was the most famous of those dedicated to Vesta, for here was the school of the Vestal virgins, whose duty it was to tend her ever-living fire, as any neglect on their part might bring some public calamity upon Rome. This altar was jealously guarded, and when, as it sometimes happened, enemies threatened the city, the Vestals carried the fire of Vesta down to the Tiber and kept it in concealment until the danger was over. Since so much depended on the watchfulness and fidelity of the Vestals, the office of priestess to the temple was held in high honor, and the maidens were chosen from the noblest of families in Rome. They entered the service at the youthful age of 6, and spent 30 years in the temple. The first 10 years were devoted to learning their important duties. The next decade was the period for filling the office of priestess and performing all the solemn rites that belonged to the worship of Vesta. The last 10 years were given to instructing the novices. When the 30 years of service were over, the Vestals could continue in the temple, or leave it and marry, if they so desired. But so holy were the Vestal virgins thought to become through their long residence in the temple, that it was held a sort of sacrilege for any man to consider marrying them. Therefore, the priestesses usually died, just as they had lived, in the service of the goddess. The chief duty of the Vestals was to watch in turns, by night and by day, the sacred fire, and see that the flames never grew dim. During their entire period of service, they were obliged to keep the strictest vows of chastity, under penalty of being buried alive in a vaulted room built especially for this purpose by King Numa Pompilius. The Vestals were, however, so true to all their vows made at the great altar fire that in 1,000 years only 18 had failed in their promises and thus suffered punishment because of it. The story is told that the Vestal Tucia was accused of having broken her vow, but was able to prove her purity by being given the miraculous power to carry water in a sieve from the Tiber to the temple. Though the restrictions placed upon the Vestals were severe, and the rules of their order were pitilessly enforced, yet the privileges they enjoyed were such as to raise them in dignity above the other women of Rome. They were entirely released from all paternal authority. They had conspicuous places at the theatres and gladiatorial shows, and occupied seats of honor at all public festivals. Treaties and important state documents were entrusted to their care as in a place inviolable, and their persons were held so holy that when they died, they were buried within the city limits, a privilege that was granted only to a few. When they went abroad, each was preceded by a lictor, and consuls, praetors, and even tribunes made way for them, while if any one passed under their litter, he was put to death. If they chanced to meet a criminal on his way to punishment, they could demand his release, provided that it could be proved that their meeting was accidental. The Vestals wore a robe of pure white linen, with a wide purple border, and over their shoulders was a purple mantle. When the festivals of Vesta, the Vestalia, were held, the priestesses marched in procession through the streets, carrying their sacred fire, while the Roman matrons followed them barefooted, chanting hymns in praise of Vesta. During these ceremonies, all work was suspended in the city. The houses were decked with flowers, and the beasts used in procession were wreathed in garlands. Banquets were set out before the houses, and people gave themselves to gaiety. When Aeneas fled from the burning Troy, and took with him some of the fire from the temple of Vesta, as the most necessary thing in founding a new city, he also brought to the shores of Italy his own household goods, or penates, who presided over the daily affairs of the household, and were the guardians of each member of the family on whose hearth they had held in the place of honor. The statues of the penates were of clay, wax, ivory, silver, or gold, according to the master's wealth, and were always carried to the new home when the family changed its dwelling place. Now, when the common meal was served, only a small portion of it was set aside for the penates, and a libation of wine was poured to them from the hearth. In return for this daily deference, the penates blessed the household with happiness and prosperity. The Lares were also worshipped by the Roman family, though they were quite unknown to the Greeks. They were the divinities that preserved the family unity, and often were a sort of embodiment of the spirit of its head and founder. The Lares also guarded the welfare of the city, and presided over the fortunes of those great groups of families that were probable foundations of every Roman town. Tradition tells us that the Lares were the two children of Mercury, and a beautiful naiad named Lara. This nymph was so loquacious that she talked from morning to night, and was very fond of prying into other people's affairs, that she might thereby have some new subjects of conversation. One day she had heard Jupiter making love to a beautiful wood nymph, and instead of keeping the matter discreetly to herself, she hurried off to tell Juno of the whole affair. The impertinence so angered Jupiter that he demanded to punish her severely, and also to prevent her from doing any more tale-bearing. So he had poor Lara's tongue cut off. Then he summoned Mercury, and bade him to take the nymph to Hades, where the sight of her sad face could never offend his eyes. On the way down to Pluto's kingdom, Mercury fell in love with his fair companion, and instead of leading her into Hades, took her into a kindlier place, where he soon won her love, and persuaded her to be his wife. The two children of Mercury and Lara were called Lares, and to them the Romans paid many honors, reserving for them a place of honor on the family hearth. Minor deities. 1. Aeolus. Not so far away from sunny Sicily and the deep crater of Etna in which Vulcan built his glowing forge were the Aeolian Islands, now called the Lipari Islands, where Aeolus, the god of the wind and storms, kept his turbulent children. He never allowed them to roam at will, but held them so secretly bound in a great cave, and let them loose at one time when they needed to exercise or when the gods demanded their release. Only once they were allowed to give free play to their boisterous feelings and rush over the waters, making havoc everywhere. And this was when Jupiter sent a deluge upon the impious earth. Since that time, the winds have never roamed at large, though they always chafe at being restrained in their narrow prison and long to break free. Aeolus wooed and married the dainty Aurora, goddess of the morning, who bore him his sons, i.e. Boreas, the north wind, Nautus, the south wind, Eorus, the east wind, and Zephyrus, the soft and gentle west wind. Now, sometimes Aurora sought the services of her children, but they were entirely under the control of their father Aeolus, who ruled them with a strict hand. Sometimes when the stately Juno sought his assistance, he let the winds sweep over the calm sea until the waves rose mountain high, for he was reputed to have received his royal status as god from Juno's hands, and so was ever anxious to serve her. Once, at her request, he let loose the fiercest winds to destroy the ships of Aeneas, that unfortunate hero who was always being pursued by cruel Juno's unrelenting hate. The goddess was so eager for his destruction that she went herself to the cave of the winds and begged Aeolus to shatter the Trojan ships. So a terrible storm broke over the sea, and the winds drove the vessels of Aeneas far out of their course, scattering them here and there, until no two of them could see each other amid the fury of the tempest. When Neptune realized what was happening, he lifted his head above the white-capped waves and saw the Trojan ships tossed about and beaten out of their course. As he himself had given no commands for such a storm, he knew it was the never-ending hatred of Juno for the Trojans that had brought about their disaster. But the sea, and all that therein is, was Neptune's to control, and he was justly angry with Juno's interference. So he recalled the winds from their mad race and bade the storm cease. Quite differently did Aeolus treat another famous hero, Ulysses, whose ships on the long homeward journey touched the Lipari Islands. Here the wanderer was hospitably entertained by Aeolus, and when he set sail again, the kindly god sent the west wind to blow the ships gently over the sea, while he shut up the blustering winds in a leather bag and tied it with a silver string. This bag he gave to Ulysses, the sagacious, and bade him keep it close until the journey was over. For 9 days and nights The hero stood at the helm, watching, while the west wind bore the ships along without the help of oars. At last, exhausted by his long vigil, Ulysses fell asleep, and the sailors, believing that the bag contained treasure that King Aeolus had generously given, untied the string and freed the roaring winds. The ships were now driven hither and thither by the madly rushing force, and were tossed over the sea far away from the longed-for Ithaca. Finally, they were blown back to the Lipari Islands, where Aeolus received them but coldly, and refused to help them any further. So they turned their prows once more towards home, and worked wearily against the weather and the slow pull of the oars. The Athenians built a temple to Aeolus, and is generally known as the Tower of the Winds, or simply the Temple of Aeolus. The structure is hexagonal, and on each side there is a flying figure of one of the winds. Notus, or Auster, the south wind, was usually represented by an old man with dusky wings. He is clad in a black robe, and his head is covered with clouds, for he sends the rains and sudden showers. Eurus, the east wind, was a young man full of impetuous and lively motion. Chorus, the northwest wind, drove clouds of snow before him, and Boreas was a figure rough and shivering. Zephyrus had a lapful of flowers, and was the one the wind sent to play among children. Boreas was the bringer of hail and tempests, and when he wooed the nymph Orithyia, he sought in vain to approach her gently, and breathe his love softly. But he could not sigh, and his lightest whisper frightened the maiden by its harshness. So Boreas gave up attempting to win her by gentle means, and boldly carried her off to his home in the midst of snow and ice. Their children were Zetes and Calais, winged warriors who accompanied the Argonauts on their famous expedition, and performed valuable service in driving away the Harpies. 2. Janus. Janus, the god of the past, present, and the future, of gates and entrances, of war and peace, was said to be the son of Apollo. But as he is a Roman god, and entirely unknown to Greek mythology, his ancestry is a matter of doubt. He presided over the beginning of everything, and was therefore invoked first in every undertaking, even before Jupiter. He opened the year and the seasons, and the first month of the year was called after him. He was the porter of heaven, and in this capacity he was represented as holding a key in his left hand and a staff or scepter in his right. On earth, he was the guardian of deity of gates, and as such, he always had two faces, turned in opposite directions, because every door, of course, looks both ways. Another explanation of his physical duality is that as god of the past and future, he sees what is behind and what is before. Janus was also considered an emblem of the sun, and therefore had two faces, one to look at its rising, and one to see its setting. Sometimes these faces were alike, but more often they were represented by a white-haired and white-bearded old man on one side, and a smooth-cheeked youth on the other. Well, at Rome, Numa Pompilius is said to have dedicated to Janus the covered passage, erroneously called a temple, that stood close to the Forum. This was kept open in times of war and closed in times of peace. But such was the belligerent nature of the Romans that the gates were closed but 3 times in 700 years, and then only for a short period. Well, as he was the god of all beginnings, the first of every new year, month, and day was held sacred to Janus, and special prayers and sacrifices were then offered at his shrines. When he presides over the year, he is represented as holding the number 300 in one hand and 65 in the other. Festivals in honor of Janus were celebrated on the first day of the new year, and on this day people exchanged visits, good wishes, and gifts, which usually consisted of sweetmeats and copper coins, showing on one side the double head of Janus. The sacrifices offered to Janus on New Year's Day and at other times of beginnings were barley, incense, cakes, and wine. 3. Iris and Aurora. Iris was the special attendant of Juno, and was often employed as a messenger by both Juno and Jupiter. In the Iliad she is the swift servant of the gods, but in the Odyssey it is Mercury who is the messenger to and from Olympus, and Iris is never mentioned. Sometimes Iris is described as the rainbow itself. Sometimes the rainbow is the only road over which she travels, and which therefore vanishes when it is no longer needed. When Juno sends Iris to the cave of sleep, she assumes her garments of 1,000 colors, and spans the heavens with her curving arch. As the personification of the rainbow, that brilliant phenomenon that vanishes as quickly as it appears, Iris might easily be considered the swift messenger of the gods. Aurora, rosy-fingered goddess of the dawn, opened the gates of the morning for the impatient horses of the sun, who chafed at being held behind golden bars until Apollo was ready to start forth on his daily course, attended by the faithful Hours. Though Aurora was the wife of Aeolus and mother of the winds, and she had the usual weakness of the deities of Olympus for falling in love with mortals who won her favor. Thus, she became enamored of the young hunter Cephalus, but was unable to gain his love, as he himself had already wedded the fair Procris, one of Diana's nymphs. The happiness of these lovers was a maddening sight to the jealous Aurora, and she determined to find some way to end it. Procris had bought her husband as a dowry a hunting dog named Lelaps, who could outrun the swiftest deer, and a javelin that never missed its mark. So all day long Cephalus hunted in the forest, and his long absences gave the malicious Aurora an excuse for whispering to the young wife that her husband spent his time in the society of a wood nymph. For some time Procris resisted these suggestions of the goddess, but at last was overcome by jealousy. She followed Cephalus to the forest to see who the maiden was that charmed him. At noon, the weary hunter sought his accustomed resting place, and as he lay beneath the wide-spreading tree, he called to the breeze to come and refresh him. Believing that he referred to some wood nymph, Procris sat down among the bushes in swoon, and her husband, hearing the leaves rustle suddenly behind him, hurled his javelin into the thicket, supposing that some wild beast was crouching near him, ready to spring. To his horror, he discovered the body of Procris, and though he did all he could to staunch the wound made by his unerring spear, his wife died in his arms, but not before an explanation had been given. Though Aurora had succeeded in separating the lovers forever, she did not thereby gain the affections of Cephalus, but was obliged to console herself with the Trojan prince, Tithonus. She begged Jupiter to confer upon him the boon of immortal life, but forgetting that he would sometime grow old, she neglected to ask for him the greater gift of eternal youth. For a while she was very happy with her lover, but as soon as he lost the attractions of youth, she wearied of his company, and she wished to get rid of him. She shut him up in a room of her palace, where his feeble voice could often be heard, and then, knowing that he would never die, she cruelly changed him into a grasshopper. The son of Aurora and Tithonus was Memnon, who became king of the Ethiopians, and went with a band of warriors to help his kindred in the Trojan War. He fought bravely, but at length met his death at the hands of Achilles. When he fell on the battlefield, Aurora commanded her sons, the winds, to carry his body to the banks of the river Aespus in Asia Minor, where a tomb was erected to his memory. To honor him further, Jupiter caused the sparks and cinders from his funeral pyre to be changed into birds, which divided into 2 flocks and fought until they fell into the flames. Every year, on the anniversary of Memnon's death, the birds returned to celebrate the funeral rites in this same strange way. When the flames from the funeral pyre had burnt out, Aurora sat by the ashes of her son, weeping and mourning her loss, and the many tears that she shed turned into glistening dewdrops. In Egypt there were 2 colossal statues, one of which was said to be the statue of Memnon, and tradition tells that when the first rays of morning fell upon it, it gave forth the sound like the snapping of heart strings. 4. Flora, Vertumnus, and Pomona. Flora, goddess of flowers and of spring, was not among the deities worshipped in Greece, but she was everywhere honored among the Romans. She was reputed to have married Zephyrus, the balmy west wind, and with him she wandered happily over town and country, distributing her favors with lavish hand. Though the gentle goddess was universally beloved, her principal devotees were young girls, who delighted in keeping her altars decorated with fruits and garlands of flowers. Her festivals were held during the month of May, and were called Floralia. Vertimus and Pomona were also Roman deities, and presided over orchards and gardens. Pomona was a hamadryad, and was so devoted to the care of her trees that she scorned the idea of love. Fauns and satyrs sought to woo her, and Silvanus, a woodland deity, tried in vain to approach her. Even the wily Pan was never able to come near enough to urge his suit. But the youthful god, Vertumnus, was not to be discouraged by the coldness of the nymph, and determined to win her for his wife. Hoping to catch her eyes and so get to speak with her, he assumed various disguises. How often did he carry the ears of corn in a basket under the guise of a hardy reaper? How often he bore a whip in his sturdy hand, so that you would have sworn he had instantly been unyoking the wearied oxen. Now he was carrying a ladder, and you would suppose he was going to gather fruit. Sometimes he was a soldier with a sword, sometimes a fisherman taking up the rod. But no attractions in the form of a man could induce Pomona to leave her orchard, or to admit one of the hated beings. At last, the resourceful Vertumnus hit upon the plan that brought him his well-earned success. Having bound his brows with a colored cap, leaning on a stick, and with white hair falling around his temples, he assumed the shape of an old woman and entered the well-cultivated garden. After praising the fruit and the flowers, the pretended old woman began to ask Pomona why she had persistently remained unwed, and told her how foolish it was to fly from love. Much to the surprise of Vertumnus, the maiden seemed to receive this advice very kindly, and when he went on to speak of a certain youthful god who had sought her love, he was delighted at gaining the confession from Pomona that she might be willing to listen to Vertumnus if he came to her. At this admission, the bold lover threw off his disguise and claimed the fulfillment of the maiden's promise. The story of Hercules. Hercules was the son of Jupiter and Alcmene, a lovely princess, the granddaughter of Perseus and Andromeda. Juno hated her, just as she did with all of her mortal rivals, and sought to bring misery and suffering to the unoffending maiden. When she learned that Hercules, the son of Alcmene, was born, she sent 2 immense serpents with poison fangs to attack the child while he slept. The child happened to waken just as the creatures were twining themselves about him, and grasping their necks in each of his tiny hands, he strangled them, thus showing from his birth the wonderful strength that was later to make him into a famous hero. The education of Hercules was entrusted to Chiron, the most renowned of the centaurs, who had himself been instructed by Apollo and Diana in hunting, medicine, music, and the art of prophecy. The idea of a creature half man and half horse, well, that was not so repulsive to the ancients, who were too fond of a horse to consider a man's union with him degrading. When Hercules left the kindly tutelage of Chiron, he set out to his own adventures, and before he had travelled far, he had met 2 beautiful women, each of whom offered to guide him on his journey. Kakia told him that if he followed her, he would gain love, riches, and a life of ease. And Arete, virtue, promised him honor, bought at the price of hardship, poverty, and endless toil. And so Hercules faced the choice to follow Kakia, the one of vice, or Arete, the path of virtue. For a while, the youthful hero deliberated over the two very different rewards offered to him, and at last he gave his choice to Arete, virtue, who henceforth led him through many perils and into labors such as no man had ever yet performed. Like most heroes, Hercules was a great wanderer, and on one of his journeys he came to the city of Thebes, where Creon, the king, entertained him and showed him so much favor that when Hercules asked for the hand of Creon's daughter Megara in marriage, the king gladly gave his consent. The hero then rested from his wanderings and spent many happy years in the society of his wife and children. But Juno had not forgotten her old hatred of Alcmene's offspring, and she determined to end his happiness. So she afflicted Hercules with a sudden madness, and in his delirium he killed his wife and threw his children into the fire. When at last he recovered his senses, he suffered terribly over the thought of the crimes he had unwittingly committed, and would have gone off to the mountains to spend his days in sorrow and remorse had not Juno demanded that he should expiate his deeds of bloodshed. Accordingly, she sent Mercury to lead him from his solitude among the hills and to take him to his cousin Eurystheus, the king of Argos, whom he was compelled to serve for a whole year. During this time he performed the 12 great labors that have made his name famous as a doer of mighty deeds. And so, the first task that Eurystheus gave to our hero was to produce the skin of a monstrous lion that inhabited the Nemean forest. This creature's frequent attacks had brought terror to all the countryside, for it was not content with carrying off cattle and sheep, but had killed the children at play and mangled the shepherds who were watching their flocks. When the people heard that Hercules was setting out to fight a lion, they tried to persuade him to give up the adventure. But he, who had strangled 2 huge serpents in his infancy, was not afraid of a lion, however fierce and strong it may be. So he boldly entered the forest, and having tracked the great brute to its den, he attacked it fearlessly and killed it with his bare hands. And then, throwing the body of the lion over his shoulder, he started back to the palace of Eurystheus. But when the king saw Hercules approaching, he begged him to leave his burden outside the city gates. And so the hero skinned the lion, took the shaggy pelt to be henceforth his favorite covering. The second labor of Hercules was to kill the Hydra, a 9-headed monster that infested the marshes of Lerna. With the blows of his great oak club, the hero was able to strike off 8 of the heads, but the central one was immortal and could not be destroyed. Further to complicate the difficulty, Hercules found that as soon as he struck off one head, 2 others sprung up in its place. To prevent this discouraging miracle from continuing, the hero bade his friend Aeolus, who had accompanied him, take a lighted brand and sear the wounds as soon as they were made. Through this wise precaution, the Hydra was finally killed, and its one immortal head was buried beneath a huge rock. While this difficult struggle was going on, Juno, always eager to thwart Hercules, sent a large crab to pinch Hercules' feet while he wrestled with the Hydra. He succeeded in crushing it with his club, but Juno did not leave its body on the trampled and blood-stained ground. In recognition of its services to her, she placed it in the sky as the constellation of Cancer, the crab. Before Hercules left the dead Hydra, he dipped some arrows in its venomous blood, knowing that any wound received from their poisoned tips would surely be fatal. Later, these arrows were of great service to Hercules, and only once did he regret their deadly quality. The next task that Eurystheus set was the capture of the golden-horned and brass-hooded stag of Serenia, which ran so swiftly that it did not seem to touch the ground. Hercules pursued the stag for many miles, but was unable to overtake it until he drove it to the cold regions of the north, where its fleetness was hindered by the great drifts of the ice-covered ground. Finally, the stag ran into a deep snowbank, and so Hercules captured it and took it home in triumph. The fourth labor to which Hercules sent his great strength was the killing of a wild boar that haunted Mount Erymanthus in Arcadia. While on this expedition, the hero was attacked by the centaurs, and when he shot at them with his poisoned arrows, one of the deadly missiles flew far and struck his loved tutor, Chiron, who was galloping towards the combatants, hoping to settle the quarrel peaceably. When Hercules saw Chiron fell, he rushed to his side and tried to staunch the fatal wound, but the dying centaur knew that his time had come, and sorrowfully he bade the hero farewell. To reward Chiron for his long service, the gods transformed him to the heavens as the constellation Sagittarius. Now, Hercules was next sent to kill the flock of fierce birds whose cruel beaks and sharp talons made havoc in the country around Lake Stymphalos. The foul mist that arose from the stagnant water over which the birds hovered was so deadly to breathe that Hercules could hardly approach the lake. But with the help of his poisoned arrows, he was able to wound the birds at a distance. After hours spent in this pestilent atmosphere, he killed the entire flock and returned to the court of Eurystheus to report his success. The most unpleasant of all of the labors of Hercules was the cleaning of the stables where Orgeus, king of Elis, kept a herd of 1,000 oxen. These stables had not been cleaned for 30 years, and when Hercules caught one glimpse of the filth within them, he felt that it was too degrading a task for him to undertake. But the work had to be done, and since he could not put his hand to anything so foul, he looked about for some other means to accomplish the labor. Not far from the stables flowed 2 rivers, the Peneus and Alpheus, and these Hercules turned out of their courses and made them rush through the filthy building until every part of the stables of Orgeus was washed perfectly clean. Then he restored the rivers to their former beds and returned home to report the task as fulfilled. The next labor assigned to the hero was the capture of a mad bull given by Neptune to King Minos. In the early days of his power, Minos had boasted that he could obtain anything that he wished from the gods, and had accordingly begged of Neptune a bull for the sacrifices. The kindly sea god sent a splendid offering. But when Minos saw the bull's size and beauty, he resolved to keep it. So he substituted another animal for the sacrifices. Well, this angered Neptune so much that he made the bull go mad, and it rushed here and there over the island, causing great terror among the people. The creature was finally caught and overcome by Hercules, who rode it through the waves to Greece. The offspring of this bull was the famous Minotaur, which the hero Theseus pursued through its labyrinth and slew. The eighth labor of Hercules was to bring from Thrace the horse of Diomedes. These splendid creatures the king fed on human flesh, and in order to get a sufficient supply of fresh meat, he decreed that all strangers come into his kingdom should be imprisoned, fattened up, and served as food to the horses. To punish Diomedes for his years of cruelty, Hercules fed him to his own steeds, and then led them back to Eurystheus, who was proud to be the possessor of such a prize. At the court of Eurystheus was the king's beautiful daughter, Admete, who loved purple and fine linen, and decked herself with all the jewels that her father's wealth could command. One day, Admete heard a traveller telling wonderful tales of the girdle that was worn by Hippolyte, the queen of the Amazons, and at once the spoiled princess demanded of her father that he send Hercules to procure for her the coveted girdle. And so the hero set out again, accompanied by his friend Aeolus. And after a hard and perilous journey, they came to the country of the Amazons. These were a fierce, warlike nation of women, who kept in their tribe only the girls who were born among them, and disposed the boys by killing them, or by giving them to the neighboring peoples. The girls were trained in severe military discipline, and became a race of very redoubtable warriors, whom no king cared to treat with contempt. When Hercules came before the queen, Hippolyte, she received him kindly, listened to the explanation of his visit, and even promised to give him the girdle that the selfish Admete had coveted. Before the hero and his friend set out on their journey homeward, the queen entertained them royally, with feasting and games that lasted several days. Meantime, Juno saw an opportunity for indulging her hatred of Hercules, and, taking the form of an Amazon, she mingled freely with the women. By pretending to have received a heaven-sent message, she persuaded them that the stranger had used the girdle as a mere pretext for his visit, and that his real intention was to carry off the queen. The Amazons believed this artfully contrived report, and rushed in a body to protect Hippolyte. They attacked Hercules fiercely, but he fought them away, and finally escaped with his friend, but not before he had killed several of the Amazons, including the queen, who had once befriended him. With the dearly bought girdle, he returned home, and on the way he heard the proclamation of Laomedon, that whoever would save his daughter Hesione from the sea monster would receive a large reward. Hercules then killed the beast and freed the maiden, but was obliged to leave Troy without the promised gold, because Laomedon's perfidy and greed was too much. When the ancients looked each evening at the glowing west, they pictured it as a far distant country, more wonderful than any had ever seen by mortal eyes. Here in this land of heart's desire lay the garden of Hesperides, where a dragon garnered the golden apples that grew on a wonderful tree which had sprung up miraculously to grace the wedding of Jupiter and Juno. In this far-off sunset land were also the Isles of Blessed, where mortals who had led virtuous lives were transported without ever tasting of death. Here the blessed of the gods enjoyed an eternity of bliss, and wandered happily over the isles, which had a sun and moon and stars of their own, and never felt the touch of the cold wintry winds. In this mysterious region of the west was the island of Erythea, called the Red, because it glowed in the light of the setting sun. To this spot Hercules was sent to take possession of the oxen Geryon, a monster with 3 bodies. On his journey to the island, Hercules was blocked by a huge mountain, and with one blow of his strong oak club, he cleft the opposing rock, and allowed the waters of the sea to flow through. This is now the Strait of Gibraltar, and the cliffs on either side are called the Pillars of Hercules. When the hero reached the island of Erythea, he found the oxen guarded by the giant Eurytion and his 3-headed dog, but even did this not daunt the slayer of the Hydra. He boldly attacked the giant, and after a fierce battle, in which his oak club stood him in great stead, killed both Eurytion and the monstrous dog. Then he went in search of the oxen, and after herding them closely, drove them towards his own country. On the journey homeward, he passed Mount Aventine, where the giant Bacchus lived in a rocky cave. One night, as Hercules was asleep near the mountain, the giant stole part of the cattle, and, to deceive the hero, he dragged them backwards by their tails into his cave. Hercules might have been tricked by this stratagem, if the stolen oxen had not lowed loudly as the rest of the herd passed the cave, and so betrayed their hiding place. Hercules rushed into the giant's dark, ill-smelling dwelling, slew him, and recovered all of the stolen cattle. The Story of Hercules, Part 2. One of the most difficult of Hercules' labors was to procure the golden apples that the Hesperides, daughters of Hesperus, the god of the west, guarded so jealously. At the foot of the tree coiled a fierce dragon, whose nostrils poured out fire, and whose deadly breath would have slain any venturesome robber, even if he had escaped the dragon's claws, that is. Now, as Hercules did not know in what part of the great glowing west the garden of Hesperides lay, he wandered many miles before he met with anyone who could direct him where to go. The first help he received was from the Nymphs of the Eridanus river, who were sporting on the river bank and called to Hercules to come in and join their games. Much as he would have liked to rest, the hero dared not tarry, but he begged the friendly nymphs to tell him the way to the garden of the Hesperides. Well, they could not help him, but they advised him to go to old Proteus, the ancient of the deep, who could tell him whatever he wished to know better than anyone else. So Hercules went down to the seashore and found the hoary god asleep in his cool, green cave. Knowing the old man's wiles, the hero grasped him firmly and held him fast through all the bewildering changes by which he sought to frighten away the stranger. At last, finding himself securely caught, the wizard assumed his own form, and he asked Hercules, what was it that he wished to know? The hero stated his errand, and Proteus told him, in words that never deceive, that he must find the giant Atlas, who alone knew where the garden of Hesperides lay. So Hercules started again on his search, and in the course of his journey came to the Caucasus Mountains, where he found Prometheus, the stealer of the sacred fire, bound with adamantine chains to the rock, while a vulture daily feasted on his liver. Hercules killed the foul bird, broke the chains, and set Prometheus free. And in return for his deliverance, the grateful Titan directed his rescuer where to find the giant Atlas. Following Prometheus's advice, Hercules traveled straightway to Africa, and on the way he passed through the land of the Pygmies, a tiny race of warriors who waged continual warfare with neighboring tribes, and especially with their deadly enemies, the cranes. Hercules was not aware that he had reached the country of the Pygmies, but one day, when he had fallen asleep from weariness, he was awakened by sharp prickings all over his body, and looking around, he saw a host of diminutive men attacking him with their tiny weapons. The hero laughed at these brave efforts, caught up a few of the doughy little warriors, and wrapping them in his lion skin, carried them back with him to the court of Eurystheus. As he journeyed through Africa in search of Atlas, Hercules came to the country of Antaeus, a mighty giant and wrestler, and the son of Terra, the earth. All strangers who came into the land were obliged to wrestle with him, and if they were defeated, they were immediately killed. As no one had ever overcome Antaeus, he had brought an untimely death on many a brave hero. So Hercules was eager to defeat him and avenge the unknown dead. As soon as they had grappled for the first struggle, the slayer of the Hydra knew that he had met more than his equal in strength. For a long time they wrestled, Antaeus growing stronger after each fall, and Hercules growing fainter from every additional blow of the giant's hand. Again and again, the undaunted hero threw his adversary to the ground, but Antaeus rose with redoubled vigor and continued the unequal contest. And then, all at once, Hercules remembered the tale he had once heard of a giant who drew strength from his mother earth, and believing that this was the case with Antaeus, he made a mighty effort and lifted the giant from the ground. Antaeus struggled to get his feet again on the earth, but Hercules kept him in the air and held him there until he felt the powerful body begin to weaken. Little by little, the miraculous strength oozed away, and soon Antaeus grew so weak that Hercules easily crushed the limp form with his hands. The hero then travelled on in search of Atlas, whom he finally found standing on the coast of Africa, with the great weight of the heavens resting on his broad shoulders. as Hercules looked up at the enormous figure, which reached so far into the clouds that nothing could be seen above his waist. He noticed that forests had grown up so thick and tall around that only a glimpse of the giant's huge legs could be seen through the heavy foliage. As the hero stood watching this figure, that for centuries had stood here in obedience to the divine command of Jupiter, he saw dark clouds beginning to gather about the giant's head, and soon a storm broke over the sea and land. Amid the beating of the rain and the crash of the thunder, Hercules thought he heard the voice of Atlas speaking to him, but it might have only been a peal of thunder indeed. When the storm was over and the mists rolled away from the earth, Hercules saw the head of Atlas through rifts in the scurrying clouds. The snow-white hair gave the giant's face a benign look, as it fell thick and white over the stooping shoulders that bore so terrible a weight. In a voice that he strove hard to make gentle, Atlas asked the hero what he was seeking, and Hercules told him that he had come to get some of the golden apples from the garden of Hesperides. Atlas laughed at these words, and his great shoulders shook with such merriment that a few of the stars fell out of their places. And then he told Hercules that such a feat was impossible to even so great a hero, but that if some apples would take the heavens from his shoulders for a few hours, he himself would retrieve the apples. Well, Hercules was delighted with this offer of assistance, and agreed to take the giant's burden while the latter went on his friendly errand. Very carefully, Atlas transferred the heavens to the shoulders of Hercules, and then sped westward to the garden of Hesperides. The hero was a bit troubled when he saw Atlas shake his huge shoulders and stretch himself in delight of his freedom, for it would be strange, indeed, if the giant were ready to resume his burden, having tasted the joy of liberty. With some anxiety, Hercules watched him step into the sea that came only to his knees, though he had waded out a mile from the shore. As Atlas went deeper and deeper into the waves, at first his huge bulk loomed like a cliff against the horizon, but soon it dwindled into a mere speck, and was presently lost to view. How long he stood holding the heavens Hercules never knew, but he found himself growing very weary of his burden, and anxious over Atlas's long absence. Suddenly, he saw a dark spot on the horizon, and he knew that the giant was returning. It had not been a difficult task for Atlas to reach the garden, or to pluck the golden apples from the carefully guarded tree, and Hercules, delighted with the giant's success, thanked him for his trouble, and asked him politely to take the sky again on his shoulders, for the journey back to the court of Eurystheus was a long one. Now Atlas had no desire to stand for another dozen centuries with this old burden, and seeing a good opportunity to get rid of it forever, he told Hercules that he would carry the apples to Eurystheus himself, and meanwhile the hero could keep the heavens supported until Atlas returned. Pretending that he was quite satisfied with this arrangement, Hercules bade the giant goodbye, and then hastily asked him to wait a moment while he made a pad for his shoulders to ease the weight of the unaccustomed burden. The unsuspicious giant good-naturedly agreed to this, and then took the heavens from Hercules. But instead of making a cushion, The hero picked up the golden apples, which Atlas had dropped on resuming his burden, and started back to his own country, leaving the giant to stand on the seashore forever, or at least until the pitying gods would release him. The 12th and final labor of Hercules was to bring from Hades the three-headed dog, Cerberus. With the help of Mercury and Minerva, he descended into the dreaded realm of Pluto and begged the grim monarch to let him take Cerberus into the upper world. Pluto was not willing at first to lose the guardian of his gates, even for a short time. But at length he consented to let Hercules do as he desired, on the condition that Cerberus should not be bound or any weapons be used upon him. So fierce the three-headed creature was carried, snarling and struggling in the hero's strong arms, and when the pair approached the throne of Eurystheus, the horror-struck monarch implored Hercules to take the monster back as quickly as possible, for the sight of its dripping jaws from which oozed the deadly nightshade so terrified Eurystheus that he sought refuge in a huge jar, and would not come out until his courtiers assured him that Cerberus was safely out of the country. When the 12 labors were ended, Hercules' term of service at the court of Eurystheus was over, and he was free to wander wherever he willed. He spent many years roaming through various lands and assisting other heroes who, like himself, were in search of adventure. He took part in the battle between the Centaurs and the Lapithea, joined in the Argonautic expedition, organized the first siege of Troy, and braved the terrors of Hades to bring Alcestis back to her repentant husband. The expedition against Troy was one of revenge, for the false Laomedon had never paid the gold he had promised for the release of his daughter Hesione from the sea monster, and Hercules now set out to punish the treacherous king. So he sailed for Troy with 18 ships, and the city fell into his hands with but little resistance. Laomedon was killed, but his son Priam placed on the throne of Troy, and Hesione given in marriage to Telamon, one of the Greeks who accompanied Hercules. The hero's splendid career received a check, however, for in a quarrel he killed his friend Iphitus, and the gods, angry at this unnecessary bloodshed, compelled him to go once more into bondage. So for 3 years Hercules served Omphale, the queen of Lydia, and during this time he lived very effeminately, wearing sometimes the dress of a woman, spinning wool with the handmaidens of Omphale, while the queen wore his lion's skin and wielded his renowned club. When his years of service were over, he set out again on his wanderings, and during one of his journeys he met the beautiful Deianira, the daughter of Cyanus of Caldion and sister of Meleager, famous in the Caledonian hunt. Hercules immediately sought the maiden's hand in marriage, but she had another suitor, the river god, Achelos, who had already obtained her father's consent. Deianira, however, much preferred her new lover, and begged him to free her from the betrothal with Achelos. So Hercules challenged the river god to a wrestling match, the conditions of the contest being that he who won should have the maiden in marriage. Achelos readily agreed to this way of settling their rival pretensions, for he had no doubt as to the result of the wrestling. The opponents were well matched as to strength, but the river god had one great advantage, for he could assume any form that he pleased, and thus bewilder anyone who tried to grapple him. Among his many changes, he took the form of a serpent, but when Hercules grasped it by the neck and was about to strangle it, Aeschylus became a bull and rushed at the hero with lowered horns. Skillfully eluding this unexpected attack, Hercules seized the bull by one horn and held on so firmly that when the creature tried to wrench himself free, the horn broke. This decided the victory in favor of Hercules, and Archelaus departed sullenly to his bed in the river. The broken horn was appropriated by Fortuna, the goddess of plenty, who filled it with her treasures and adopted it thenceforth as her symbol, calling it cornucopia. There was nothing now to hinder the marriage of Hercules and Deianira, and the wedding took place with much mirth and feasting. After several days of festivity, Hercules departed with his wife, and in the course of their journey homeward, they came to the river Evenus, which had grown so swollen and turbid from the heavy rains that it was impossible to ford. As the travellers stood helpless on the bank, the centaur Nessus came galloping up to them, and offered to carry Deianira across the river in safety. Grateful for this timely assistance, Hercules placed his wife on the back of the centaur, whom swam with her through the swift-flowing stream. When they reached the opposite bank, Deianira expected the centaur to stop, that she might dismount, but Nessus set off at a brisk trot, hoping to kidnap his fair rider before her husband could overtake them. Hercules heard the cries of his terrified bride, and as soon as he swam the river, he sent a swift arrow after the treacherous Nessus. The poisoned tip sank deep into the side of the centaur, and he knew at once he had received his death wound. With a pretense at repentance, he asked Deianira to forgive his rash deed, and then, as if granting her a favor, he told her to take his robe, which was stained with blood, and keep it carefully, for it had wonderful properties. He assured her that if the time ever came that Hercules' love grew cold, she had only to persuade him to put on this magic robe, and his devotion to her would become more ardent than ever before. Deianira took the robe, but said nothing to her husband of the centaur's gift, hoping that she would never have to make use of it. For many years, Hercules and his wife lived happily together, for although the hero went on to another adventure, he was always eager to return to his beloved Deianira, and she had no need to be reminded of the centaur's gift. On one of his expeditions, however, he brought back with him a fair maiden named Iole, of whom his wife soon grew to be extremely jealous. Not long after the arrival of Iole, Hercules wished to offer sacrifices to the gods in honor of his safe return, and so he sent Deianira for a suitable robe. His wife, trembling for the success of her venture, bade the messenger Lycus to carry to Hercules the magic robe of Nessus, which she had carefully guarded all these years. Hercules, not knowing the history of the fatal garment, threw it over his shoulders, and as soon as it touched his flesh, the poisoned blood began its deadly work. The body of Hercules burned suddenly as if on fire, and agonizing pains convulsed his frame. He tried to unloose the fatal robe, but it clung to his skin, and he tore off part of his flesh in trying to set himself free. In his rage and pain, he turned upon Lycas, the unhappy bearer of the poisoned robe, and seizing him in his still powerful arms, flung him into the sea from the top of Mount Eta, where they had assembled for their sacrifices. And then the hero tore up huge oak trees by their roots and built a lofty funeral pyre on which he stretched his pain-racked limbs. Calmly, he bade his serpents to apply the torch. But no one was willing to do this, even to ease his sufferings. So Hercules turned to his friend, Philoctetes, and even after giving him the poisoned arrows, begged him in pity to light the funeral pyre. The youth placed beside Hercules the hero's famous oak club and covered his body with the lion's skin. Then he applied a torch to the wood, and the flames rose over with a roar and crackling to the skies. But only the mortal part of the hero perished, for Jupiter would not allow the divinity that he had bestowed upon Hercules to suffer extinction. Purged of his mortality, the hero took his place in high Olympus, and even revengeful Juno was so reconciled to his presence that she gave him her daughter, Hebe, in marriage. And here we arrive at the end of this part of the video. If you've stuck around for this long, why don't you give us a like and subscribe? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Yeah, okay. I'd like to thank my top tier patrons and supporters. There's Dark, Carrie, Kimberly, Amber, Ben, Britt, Charles, Aaron, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, and Christine. Thank you very much. And you must know that there will be more of these kinds of videos coming up soon. But for now, let's all have a little bit of a rest. Well, it's more of a rest for me than it is for you. And I will see you in the next video. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all.